When it comes to raised beds, I feel like I know a thing or two because I've set up a ton of them. So I'm going to show you basically every tip and trick you need to think about when you're starting a raised bed garden. So what I'm going to show you is a number of different raised bed scenarios, and you can kind of choose what your scenario is and what works best in your case. So this raised bed here is actually on top of a cement pad, which is why it's a little bit higher. Now, because I don't have access to the soil ecosystem, I decided to go for about a 3-foot bed. Generally speaking, you need about 2 feet, and in this I usually do tomatoes, which is a relatively large taproot plant. You're probably thinking, Ashley, you have a huge yard. Why would you put raised beds on cement? And yes, I have a huge yard, but I have a huge yard that is heavily shaded. And because of that shade and those giant trees, I find it very difficult to grow things like tomatoes and peppers. Hence why my peppers are grown in front of these raised beds in these pots, and my tomatoes are grown in the raised beds behind me. It's actually really important to be able to put your beds in a position where they're getting enough light. So don't go for what looks good, don't go for what's convenient, go for what's actually going to yield results. And in this case, full sun over 12 hours all day, and I have 3 feet because I'm on top of cement. So this is a combination you may want to think about. Combination number 2 is actually a raised bed box. So this is raised up off the ground on stilts, and it has about 1 foot of actual soil. I didn't use compost or potting soil, I used soil in this. And inside of this, I like to grow herbs. Now, what I will say in a setup like this is because of the lack of soil or the lower volume of soil, I tend to find it grows out very quickly, meaning herbs and smaller type plants that are continual harvest, like lettuce, for example, or spinach or arugula, do best in a bed like this. You won't want to use this bed for a heavy feeder or something that needs a lot of water, because it will dry out very quickly and it'll be incredibly frustrating to deal with. So these type of beds, herbs, lettuces, leafy greens is what works best. Now behind me here, I have a regular raised bed, or kind of like a tiered raised bed. And the reason why this is a little bit shorter than that of the cement bed is because it's directly on the soil ecosystem, which gives me really good results, which means I have access to more moisture. I have access to the ground beneath it for both the roots, for fertilizer, microbes, decomposition, you name it. Now, the reason why this is slightly elevated is because I try to keep my dogs out of it as best as I can, which works very passingly, but this is another way you can do it. And if you're directly on soil, you actually wouldn't even have to go this high. And I'll show you some examples of ones that I have directly on top of my lawn in the front yard that aren't this height and are actually a little bit lower. Now, this is the famous raised bed from my Instagram, where you guys saw me doing some pretty funny reels about trying to keep the poor cabbage in here alive. Now, what I will say is this raised bed is a self-watering raised bed. So if you're a vacationer, maybe you're looking for a raised bed at some sort of a cabin or a remote area, this is actually a really cool concept. You could make this raised bed without the kit itself and do a DIY version, but I really like this. It's very effective and it makes it really easy to water. Now, of course, it's not connected to the soil world beneath it. And so because of that, you do have to do your own work when it comes to building up microbe activity, decomposition, and just overall soil health. And in this one, I actually use potting soil over actual mineral soil because of that self-watering feature. Now, this one here is a very, very low to the ground, and I actually don't know what it's from. I just stole it from my husband, and he hasn't realized yet that I used it for a raised bed. Hopefully it's not important at all, but this, you can see, is much lower to the ground. This is actually because I'm connected to my lawn. Yes, bye-bye lawn, hello garden. I'm transferring the whole front yard into a garden. And this allows me to gain access to the moisture, the soil microbiota, and just overall soil health. So the way I did this was kind of like a Charles Dowding setup, but I used mineral soil, regular old soil. I'm not a huge fan of dumping on a lot of compost or manure, and I like soil, just regular old soil. So that's actually what's in here. Now, what I will say is because it is above the ground level, it's going to dry out a little bit faster. So if you do this sort of a setup, I encourage you to heavily mulch and really watch while you're germinating seeds that everything is properly moistened and kept moist until that germination stage is over. But because of this raised bed setup, even this little bit of a lift makes a pretty major difference when it comes to overall soil compaction or lack thereof, because it's not exposed to the walking traffic that would regularly be placed on this lawn. If I was just to put a garden in ground, this little bit of a bump eliminates that compaction force of foot traffic, and it also eliminates the compaction force of walking on it while wet. So it makes a big difference. If you don't have a rototiller or you can be bothered to till, try this. If you have disability where you aren't able to use a rototiller or a broad fork, this is definitely a go-to. Now, absolute worst case scenario is what's behind me, and that is a raised bed surrounded by cement. Let me talk to you about hot and drought type conditions. I have to treat this bed completely different than any other bed in my yard. I find it very difficult to grow anything that isn't a sedum or a chicks and hen, pretty much a succulent type plant, or has a drought tolerance to it. There's a number of things that I'd love to grow in here because it's full sun, but the surrounding cement, the fact that it's made from brick and it has very heavy clay soil, it kind of makes it difficult. Now, if I was to redo this bed and I wanted to gain the benefits of the sun and that warm soil, maybe for peppers or something to that effect, I actually would build this up much higher. So that higher bed, that higher volume of soil helps with water retention and just overall soil health. Whereas when I'm in the ground and that soil is completely surrounded by a ton of interlacing brick, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So if I was to redo it, I'd make it a little bit taller. But I hope you guys found this video helpful when it comes to raised beds. Let me know what you're thinking about for raised beds. Are you thinking half foot, a foot, changing a lawn into a garden, or something more extreme like a bed on straight up interlacing brick, whatever the case is? I'd be interested to know what your guys' garden projects are this year. Anyways, I'll talk to you next time. Bye.